Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the International Conference Restart 21, coming to you from the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom in Berlin. I'm Melinda Crane, and on behalf of our host, it is a great pleasure to accompany you today as moderator. As we saw just now in our film, the aim of this conference is, in a word, to talk about the future, about pressing challenges that will determine how our societies in general, and Europe in particular, position themselves in the post-pandemic world. We wish we could have brought everybody together in person, as the Naumann Foundation has done so often in the past. But although the situation here in Berlin is improving, we decided, in view of safety and hygiene rules, to shift to this virtual format. And we're glad that it at least offers the advantage of bringing together people spread across so many different locations and time zones. We're very pleased to have all of you with us today. Over the coming days, we will devote 4 high-ranking panels to digitalization, strategic autonomy, education, and globalization. How do we find the right balance in all of these areas between liberal values and socioeconomic resilience, between reinforcing multilateralism on the one hand and promoting closer European cooperation on the other? Outstanding speakers will share their insights with us in all 4 of our discussions. We're also eager to hear from you, dear ladies and gentlemen. Please share your questions and short comments with us using the Q&A function on this live stream. I'll pass a selection of your questions on to our panelists a little bit later on in our discussion. And we also invite you to participate in our short audience polls, because we are very eager to harvest the wisdom of the crowd. Our topic today, ladies and gentlemen, is shaping a new digital world order. How can Europe set global standards? As you know, the EU has aspirations to play a leading role in doing just that, in shaping the digital future. Following up on the GDPR, the EU's landmark 2018 legislation on data protection and privacy, the EU Commission has now introduced new proposals for a Digital Services Act and also a Digital Markets Act. Fulfillment of the EU's ambitions will depend on Europe's ability to incorporate liberal democratic principles on access and privacy, on fairness and individual rights, on competition and liability, not only into European law, but also into regulatory norms and standards with international reach. Our panel aims to explore whether and how the EU can achieve that goal. Before I introduce the participants, let me just pose a first question now to our audience, and we'll take the results with us into our first round of discussion. Our first audience poll is simple and straightforward. What do you think? Is Europe capable of setting global standards when it comes to digitalization? Please vote now using the voting tool on our live stream, and we will take a look at the results in just a moment after I introduce our panelists. And now it's a pleasure to do so, and I will keep the introduction short to maximize our time for discussion. With me here in the studio is Anne-Kathrin Riedel. She is manager of the Global Themes Division of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, and she's also chairperson of the nonprofit digital policy organization LOAD. Great to have you with us, Anne-Kathrin. Thank you so much. It's also my pleasure to welcome Professor Dr. Jan-Hendrik Passolt. He's professor of the Sociology of Technology at the European University Viadrina's New School of Digital Studies. Thanks so much for joining us, Professor Passolt. I'm also very pleased to welcome Srinivas Kodali. He's a member of the Free Software Movement of India, an independent researcher working on data, governance, and the internet, with a particular focus on intelligent transport systems. And he joins us today from Hyderabad. Great to have you with us, Srinivas. And we're also so pleased that we can welcome Eniola Mafe. She is lead for the World Economic Forum's 2030 Vision Initiative, Technology and Sustainable Development. She formerly served as head of the Niger Delta Partnership Initiative, working amongst other areas to facilitate digital transformation and access. And she joins us today from Lagos. Great to have you with us, Eniola Mafe. Now, let us get a quick look at the audience answer to that poll. And we had asked you, is Europe capable of setting global standards when it comes to digitalization? And about 56% of you say yes, so a little bit more than half. 23% say no, and not sure are around 21%. So we'll see if perhaps some of you will be convinced in the course of our discussion as to whether the answer should be a yes or a no. But let's take with us the fact that a slight majority does believe Europe is capable of setting those standards. So I'd like to ask all of our panelists to start out by giving us their take on the same question, whether you agree with the majority of the audience that Europe is capable of and the right actor to set global standards for tech regulation. And I'd also like to know whether you think that Europe has the leverage needed to do so and how important EU-shaped standards are, particularly in view of the intensifying systemic competition that we face. And I'll start right here in the studio with Anne-Catherine.
Thank you. I think we are capable to set global standards, and I think we should be more proud in doing so and in discussing about it, especially we as Germans. We're sometimes criticizing, for example, the GDPR very heavily, but as you said in the beginning, the GDPR set a global standards, and I think we could do so with things like the regulation you mentioned, the DSA, the DMA, or artificial intelligence regulation. And I also think we should do so because the digitalization will transform everything, and we need to talk more about how can we ensure human rights, civil liberties in the digital sphere. And how do we deal with, for example, China, who is setting already global standards? And I think we should discuss about this, as I said, more proudly as Europeans, and invite others to discuss with us, like we will do today, not only with our partners in the US, but also globally, because we have so much we should take care about, as I said, human rights, for example, and how can we keep them in the digital sphere? Our principles we have today, and I think this is not only talking about digitalization, but talking about democratic values, liberal democracies. How can we keep them? And so I'm really excited what our other panelists how they see this topic.
And let's get a couple of viewpoints now from our online participants. And I'll start, I'll simply go in alphabetical order here and go next to Srinivas. What's the view on this from where you sit, Srinivas? Would you say Europe does have the capabilities and the necessary position to drive global standard setting?
I think the issue is not the capacity, but the will. And I think EU has that will when one looks at EU's democratic frameworks and human rights frameworks and its long history of spreading them across the globe. So where I sit from in India, we are looking about digitization as an economic process. For us, the economic incentive is much higher than the democratic or liberal setup. So we are not valuing the importance of liberal values, human rights frameworks when we are digitizing as a nation, and that's creating its own problems for us in our society. And in India being a major IT exporter, we also want to become a player and set standards like China and Europe. So I think between economic progress and human rights frameworks, liberal values are an important framework that Europe can export to the rest of the world. As we discuss a lot about international standard settings at the UN. In fact, the UN Secretary General's latest report, I believe, on international digital cooperation actually looks at a lot of this. And standard settings is something that we all need to come together and discuss each side of digitization activities, both economic and human rights and liberal values. And in that sense, I think the political will in terms of this geopolitical play of who sets the standards it's Europe which is leading, and I think that is great for the world.
What, can I just ask you as a follow-up to that, because Anne-Catherine mentioned that the GDPR absolutely has had a kind of model effect in many places in the world. Is that true in India, which of course is a digital power in its own right?
I think India is going in a different path. We are trying to, as I said, we are trying to value economic rights. GDPR did have its influence across the world, and India still hasn't enacted its data protection law. But when we are enacting it, the draft law essentially proposes something known as a data empowerment and protection architecture, which values more about the economic incentives for citizens to share their personal data to build a digital economy in India. So I think we are creating our own paths. We are creating a third model apart from China and Europe. But like GDPR was heavily debated though. We did take some inspiration, but until our parliament approves the new data protection law, I don't know where this is going to go.
Thank you very much. Let me go now to Eniola Mafe and get your take from where you sit, both in terms of physically right now from Lagos, but also in your work for the World Economic Forum, perhaps your take on this.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I do certainly echo some of the sentiments around the long history of Europe from a cooperation perspective, from both a regional integration perspective, as many of you probably know that Africa is going through its own AfCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and that has been signed on by almost every country in Africa, and has been very much modeled around the EU integration process as well. And one piece that's very interesting and may connect with our discussion here is that within that is the digital transformation agreement, or at least that it provides a little bit in terms of standards, possibly protocols, and we'll see how that plays out over the next couple of years with this integration process of the next, I think possibly the next 9 years. And so what I think is really interesting is that I would agree, yes, that Europe playing a significant role in this for the reasons that have been laid out earlier: human rights, liberal democracy, freedom of the individual. And I think there are certainly things that can be learned, especially where I sit in Nigeria, it's been in the news a lot lately around digital access and how that plays out in terms of the physical space. And I think with the lack of process of standards and protocols, it's up to interpretation, literally. And so I think that there is certainly a lot to learn, and I do agree that Europe should play a leadership role, but I think there's two determinants I would add to this, which is one, play a leadership role with cooperation and equal partnership with other like-minded organizations and governments, especially those in the South-South. I think it's going to be very important, both from a commercial perspective, because of the number of European companies that are operating, both tech and non-tech companies that are operating in the global South, and that being kind of exported beyond, and also that it should be flexible in its nature. And I think this was part of the debate with GDPR was how flexible could it be to different locales, different demographics, where, in the case of Africa, in the case of Nigeria, while we do see a high level of internet penetration and increased digital access, we're also seeing a significant slowing of some very important pieces around that tie into individual privacy, data, and data sovereignty. So I think there is a lot to be learned through that process, and I think it would be very important to have the determinants of that leadership by Europe to be connected with the cooperation mechanisms that it naturally has with many other regions and decisive countries like in India and Nigeria, Brazil, and other kind of large populaces that are in the global south.
Thank you very much for that. We will pick up on several of the points that both of you have made. Let me go now to Professor Jan-Hendrik Passolt and get your take on it.
Yes, thank you very much. And also thank you for letting me be part of this exciting conversation today. So in terms of, as I'm the scholar in the room, I should probably add some pieces of, or some grains of salt. So in terms of the should Europe be able to set global standards, my answer would be a resounding yes, of course. Regarding the capacity currently, specifically, well, it depends a little bit on how you both define standards for technology development on the one hand, and then who you actually mean by Europe, or which kind of institution in Europe. For example, if you go to the regulatory realm, then of course you see ambition, and that is highly valuable in the global arena of tech regulation that is currently emerging. Not only in terms of the DSA and DMA, which were already mentioned, but also in terms of the suggestions for Data Governance Act, for example, and the AI Act that is also coming up in terms of finding normative and ethical and regulatory standards for AI introduction and monitoring and use. On the level of tech standards, one needs to put into the discussion that technology is not only regulated through law, of course, but simply by technological standards, formats, forms of tech developments. And there, well, there could be more of ambition. So more is possible in that regard, I guess. Also more coordination. Let me just make 3 examples. If you look at, for example, the question of innovation and research funding, there is a huge disconnection between the types of ideas and standards and normative frameworks that the Commission applies in its regulatory ideas, well, compared to what it actually funds in terms of research and innovation, on the other hand. Same is true for industrial policy. Of course, we have these high-reaching claims for regulatory standards in the DSA and DMA, but on the question of industrial policy, we're still speaking about European champions and starting and being able to produce big companies that are Europe-based and these kind of issues. And more coordination between these different rhetorics and different ideas could be helpful to actually put the EU in a position that can set standards. And the third example would be its own development of technologies as a public institution or as a set of public institutions. If you, for example, look at the various options that the Commission would have in terms of actually strengthening technological developments that look the way we would like to imagine it, well, it does little to actually push these developments towards human rights, towards openness, towards democratic standards. And there, a lot more is possible, I think.
Thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. And we will definitely drill deeper on some of those points, but perhaps it's worth pointing out in the context of the last point that you made that certainly the pandemic revealed even here in Germany, in Europe's biggest economy, glaring deficits when it comes to digitalization, especially in the realm of government and services. So lots of room for improvement there. Let me start out now with a deeper dive on the question of priority areas. And I think it's interesting, ladies and gentlemen, that even 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been having this discussion because it isn't all that long ago that the internet was in a way associated with a Wild West aura of anything goes, regulation free. But that clearly has changed, and policymakers everywhere are taking a closer look at areas from data protection and cybersecurity to artificial intelligence, as Jan-Hendrik Passolt just mentioned, digital commerce, social media, free speech, taxation of tech giants, you name it. Lots of different political issues on the agenda. So before we go on, we want to take another quick audience poll to get your take, ladies and gentlemen, on where you think that global standards are most urgently needed. Let me ask the technical team to please activate that second audience poll. And you see you've got multiple choices here, ladies and gentlemen, so please vote between data protection, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, digital commerce, social media and free speech, taxation of tech giants, or the wonderful category other. And we'll just give it a little bit of time to run. Not quite sure how long we need to get those results back. Or actually, let's do this. I'll go on with our next question. Oh no, we're already, okay. Lots of results coming in already, great. So I'm just gonna give this a little more time to play out. 66% of those who responded say cybersecurity is the top priority. So that is the highest share of respondents concerned about standards for cybersecurity. And no wonder, just the past few weeks have seen extremely shocking examples of major hacks, including in very sensitive infrastructure. Then we have the next largest category would be 56% saying social media and free speech is a critical area for standards. And again, we are seeing initiatives in that area. We're going to talk about them in just a minute. Then data protection, 53%. All of you in our panel have mentioned that as a key area, people's rights to their data. And that is clearly something that all the respondents are concerned about. After that, we've got 44% say both artificial intelligence and taxation of tech giants. So the same share of respondents seeing both of those as important. And interestingly enough, only 9% concerned about digital commerce issues. Digital commerce, of course, is the EU Commission's latest big initiative. But not that many people here seem to feel that that's a major priority area. So on the basis of that poll, let's go on. And again, I'm just going to ask our panel to give us their response to that, but I'm going to come to you last this time, Anne-Catherine, and start out, if I may, with Jan-Hendrik Passot. What's your take on that? Bearing in mind, of course, that we have a fairly international group with us today, I hope.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess let me just comment on the results, which is really interesting because in terms of cybersecurity, we're actually tackling a field that is, well, most traditional in terms of how the EU actually handles that, and or member states in the EU actually handling that, and to see some infusion of ideas of liberty and democratic oversight in that regard would be really on the radar for that. Social media and free speech online is actually a field that the EU has been starting to tackle very interestingly. It has started with the creation of what it calls the EDMO hubs, which is the local pan-national hubs that take care of a certain region, of a certain media system combination, and it has created a set of them just recently, I think a few weeks ago. Let's see what they actually are building. And it might be that joining both tech competencies on the one hand and media competencies in terms of oversight in one research-driven institution could be a blueprint that could spread across the globe, like it did in the terms of the GDPR as a standard that is basically set up because we have like an invention of an institutional solution that might be able to tackle the problem of handling social media and free speech in that regard.
Can you just tell me what you would consider to be the biggest priority from your own point of view as an expert?
Well, one of the interesting problems lies in this connection with taxation and the dealing with monopolies worldwide. And because many of the sources of power that have been shifting many areas of tech standard setting in the last, let's say, 10, 15 years from pretty democratic basic ideas, for example, in terms of internet governance, to a situation where now global larger companies, basically set standards because of their sheer size and the number of engineers they can send to these committee meetings. That's one of the real issues that has been changing things under the hood, one might say, in the last 10, 15 years. And so dealing with the problem of monopolies, dealing with the problem of breaking at least the de facto standard setting powers of large tech companies would be on the radar, I think, from my perspective. And many other of the problems we're talking about just follow up from that, actually.
Thank you very much. Let me go now to Srinivas to get your take both on the audience response, but also what you see as the top priority.
I think cybersecurity is something that is echoing across the world, like especially with COVID-19 and people, like social interactions, commerce, everything has gone but still. And with that, so did the vulnerabilities, right? Like people have suddenly become vulnerable in the cyberspace. They do not know how exactly it functions all the time. And there are always these new applications that they are interacting with. And cybersecurity is definitely something that is important. In India, we've been going through major breaches and we haven't seen any major actions even from the regulator. And that's disappointing in some sense. And I echo Professor Jan Hendrik's views on standard settings and taxation. And if one looks at IETF, I mean, I know he has mentioned the Internet Governance Forum and how big tech and large organizations are sending lots of their engineers to set standards. But if one looks at IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, where a lot of technology standard making happens, in India, we have actually started rejecting it. The people, at least the people who built India's digital public platforms, call themselves India's IETF, which is sort of a private consortium, a lobby group of sorts. It's largely similar to the way how W3C, the World Wide Web Corporation, operates, but there is no open-end process here. At least when you look at IETF, you have a call for proposals, you have global participation, there's multi-stakeholderism, and that's missing a lot in India. And I think when you look at setting some of these standard bodies or re-looking at standardization processes, I think it's important to look at the power of the people who are setting these standards and how do we bring in multi-stakeholders. To cite a small example, in India, there are a lot of farmers who are protesting on the street. And part of that, we are also digitizing farming. And India is now setting standards for farming, right? Like we are building digital infrastructures for agriculture. Now, who gets to set those standards affects India's farmers. Do you let Microsoft set it or do you let Indian farmers set it? So who and what sort of power enables these standard making processes is something important. On that note, I'll end with social media. I think social media is something we all need to look into together. Nobody has the right solution for it. It's ballooning, right? Like the problems with social media across the world. Twitter just got banned in Nigeria. We don't know what's going to happen with Twitter in India. They have been in confrontation with government of India. So we have to wait and watch in that space.
Apparently, a good deal of false information was spread in regard to the pandemic in India via social media platforms from what the reporting has told us. And also very interesting, your point on cyber security, Srinivas, because in fact, hacks have taken off enormously over the past year with so many companies now very, very dependent on online interaction. They've become that much more vulnerable, clearly. So let me go now to Eniola to get your thoughts.
Yes, I know we want to debate, and I'm by myself nodding with my other colleagues on the panel as well, which I think underpins maybe two things. One that I'm seeing is obviously COVID, aside from the massive toll on global health and health and security of individuals, has been a stress test for many of the terminologies that we kind of spun around and thought about in absentia of actually stress testing them, actually living that. So now I think what we're seeing across the board, which I think is actually exciting from a practitioner perspective, is that no one really has the answers. And so it means that the standards and it was mentioned earlier, the standards, the way in which standards need to be developed could be a mixture of de facto, could be a mixture of negotiation, and then kind of the typical fiat, the top-down approach. And I think what would be really interesting, especially with the two areas that I think are critical, which I think tied into the audience poll, which was cybersecurity, and expanding that terminology to what that really means, because I'm actually not surprised that it was 9% for commercial activity, because essentially many of those issues where in a country like mine, where a lot of transactions are actually done both on Instagram, on Twitter, online essentially, and through your mobile phone. So we are looking at mobile wallets. We're looking at a lot of kind of leapfrog technology in countries like mine that are not even nowhere near the laptop. And so we're looking at this very, very dynamic activity that's happening on the ground. And it's not being met by the same kind of flexible, agile standards and regulation. In fact, it's actually met with somewhat draconian regulation, which is just stop it all, and then we'll figure it out later. We've seen this with crypto in Nigeria. We've seen this with Twitter with Nigeria. And one example I will use and mentioned here with Twitter was the banning of Twitter. It was in the absence of actual liable laws that have been actually enacted. So I think this is where the real opportunity is to start plugging in the gaps of what we're doing in the digital space. And I think Jan Hendrik actually talked to this, what we're doing in the digital space, and connecting that back to the actual lives that we're living in the physical space. And the idea is that I think it's very clear to the consumer that those are one and the same. They operate almost seamlessly. But I think our laws, regulations across the board, this is Europe, Africa, India, I think are always playing catch up. So how do we find these elements where we can maybe draw the gap a little bit closer, where we are not in a situation where we're actually learning from multiple regions? And I think there's a lot here in terms of what Europe is doing, and vis-a-vis its cooperation through APCs and others, that I think could really be exciting over the next 5 years for sure.
Very, very interesting. I'd like to come back to that in just a moment, but let me stay just for a moment longer with the EU's role and ask Anne-Catherine, when you look at the sum total of the different initiatives that the EU has come up with over the past few years, the GDPR, the artificial intelligence package, initiatives to tax tech giants, and now the Digital Services and Digital Markets Act. Would you say that so far the approach is addressing the key challenges in the right way? Or where might you say your priorities going forward would differ somewhat?
Well, I think they do. I like to add also the data transfer to the US is very important for us Europeans, that we find a solution there for the SCIP privacy shield. I think that's very important. And I think, well, yeah, the DMA and the DSA are heavily discussed here, and they are, I think, from my feeling, the most discussed regulation packages we are discussing here. And from a German perspective, for example, with a DSA, I think it's great to see that the regulators are using now different approaches to regulate. So here in Germany, we had the Law Enforcement Act, the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, and from my point of view, it's a not optimal way to regulate social media platforms, because it's only focusing on content. And I think these are tech companies. And so we should focus also on tech regulation and not only on content. So the DSA focus a lot on processes, on dynamics and so on. And you mentioned the disinformation part. So how do we regulate this? It's very difficult because mostly it's freedom of speech and we should ensure freedom of speech. And we here at the Friedrich Naumann Foundation just published a paper on social media councils. So similar to the Facebook Oversight Board, which is not perfect, but I think a very interesting way to discuss. So I think we need to broaden our imagination, our discussions about how can we regulate this totally different digital world, because it's a transformation. And I think we need to be more creative and especially from as a European person, it's very important what Eniola, for example, said, that you have all this leapfrogging and other ways how you don't have the laptop, you do everything with a mobile. And so we need to look a bit more into the future, how we also as Europeans deal with a digital world and shop online and, for example, and see and look at countries like Nigeria or India and be more a bit we need to look more forward at in how we do regulation, because I think we also will use our mobiles way more often. We see this also when we talk about digital identities and so on, that the mobile phone will be the key essential tool which we are using. And I think we're not really prepared for that.
In terms of the audience response, were you surprised that only 9% found that e-commerce was a priority, given the fact that you just said a lot of attention is now being paid to the Digital Service Act and the Digital Markets Act? And if you take a look at what these two packages, they're not yet passed, but these two proposed bills would do, it's not simply regulating e-commerce per se, but also regulating the role of, for example, very large online platforms, their liability, and so on. It's an interesting attempt to get closer to a sense of, where do we think we have to put some limits on these enormous tech players?
Yeah. And for me, what's also surprising that cybersecurity was on the top list, because here from the German perspective, I often think that cybersecurity isn't really much an issue or not ranked so highly because people don't understand how important it is. And we mentioned it several times now, how fragile our infrastructure here is. And I think not many people already also in Germany know that one person actually died because of a cyber attack on a hospital in Düsseldorf. And so that also surprised me. Maybe this commerce thing, it's maybe too complicated. I don't know, too many stuff that's involved in commerce. I don't know.
Yeah, possibly. Let me now get all of us to talk a little bit more about some of the points that you've raised in regard to international cooperation and also competition. And if I can go back, first of all, to Jan Hendrik, technologies ranging from 5G to the Internet of Things, cloud computing, data protocols will, as you said, have a very profound impact on the future of industries that are central to the EU's economic development. And those are industries ranging from mobility and energy to health and manufacturing. Do you think that European voices are sufficiently present in the international standard setting bodies that are shaping the framework for these technologies? I often hear that they're not. But you undoubtedly know a great deal more.
Yes, thank you for that question. Also, it maybe gives me an opportunity to go a little bit deeper on what those voices could actually utter at these tables. So in terms of, we discussed this a little bit earlier in terms of the various places in which global technology standards are actually set. And those are not only legislation, this is not only regulation, but it's a huge set of standard setting bodies, it's a huge set of committees, mostly private driven, sometimes open participatory, and sometimes some of them in principle open and participatory, but in de facto, well, driven by the set of engineers that actually visits them. And in this regard, the question is not only do we have enough European voices at these different tables, but actually what are they saying? And we've started out this discussion with claims of driving tech development specifically from Europe or with the European spirit, one might say, in terms of human rights, in terms of protection of rights, in terms of open democratic values. And the question is, do those ideas, do those principles have a role to play in standard setting discussions? And well, I would doubt so in many regards. There, a lot of things have to do with market power, with the question of actually protecting European interests in terms of commercial interests. And that creates issues and complicated problems of integration of others later on. Just let me give another example of the regulatory frameworks that you have just talked about with Ann-Kathrin. If you take a look at the DSA in its construction, its basic setup is well, a blueprint of harmonization in Europe, one might say. So it just basically creates these digital services coordinator institutions at every member state level. And then the bigger it gets, the more Brussels gets involved. Basically, that's the idea. So how to include non-European actors in those regulatory frameworks later on, once we've set this up, how to deal with international collaborations that, well, basically go beyond the European member states. Well, that is unclear. And also how to coordinate that internally. So who is actually taking the roles of these coordinating bodies? This is, well, say, not set up, one might say. So the real question is how to open up these different tables, one might say, of standard setting to different voices and to diverse voices and to voices from Europe, but also from other parts of the world that would bring the arguments in that we started this discussion off with. So, and there it's a question of participation, it's a question of openness, it's the question of access, actually. It's a question of integration into these projects. And there's a lot to do, I guess.
We want to come back to that issue, but let me just drill a little bit deeper one more time on the European position and role. And my question to you, you mentioned this briefly, Jan-Hendrik, in your first remarks, but if you could just say a little bit more about it, because it's something The Economist has just written about, saying that if Europe is really so ambitious about shaping the future digital order, it needs to have a few digital champions of its own, and that it's still badly behind. And if you look at the developments over the past 20 years, it's actually fallen further behind. Do you see any likelihood of that changing? Do you see, besides SAP, any promising contenders?
Well, the question is, do you have to conquer size with size, basically? Or in terms of giving voice, could you also conquer size with, well, manifold voices, basically? So Europe's strength, for example, is in smaller and medium-sized economies and companies. But of course, for any of those actors, also Europe's strength in the digital realm is very much so in civil society organizations in terms of integrating that into tech development. But for each of these organizations, for each of the smaller companies, taking part in, for example, these committees or standard setting bodies, or even in regulatory frameworks set up by the EU now, well, that's tricky because of sheer resources, of sheer personnel, of sheer time, basically. And of course, and there some concrete actions could go into that. For example, supporting smaller and medium-sized companies to be actually able to play a role in these settings and at these tables, one might say. And also in terms of public institutions and civil society organizations, supporting them to play an active role in these committees, setups, tables, would actually help conquer size much easier than just trying to push money into just one big champion that would, in the end, just be like a digital Airbus, for example. And if it fails, well, both the money's basically spent and no seat at the table is actually gained.
And Katrine, can I get you to weigh in on that same issue? Because of course, supporting private sector initiative and in particular SMEs is a big part of the Naumann Foundation's focus. So perhaps you can also say a little bit about Europe's digital champions or lack thereof.
Well, can I add to that? I would fully agree to what Jan-Henrik said, and that the strength of Europe is that we have multiple voices and different perspectives. And I think we focus too much on this, like we don't have a Google here, we don't have an Amazon here, and I'm not sure if this is the right discussion. So I think we lost this game, and maybe we should focus more on industries, and we call it Industry 4.0 and machine data. And I think especially from Germany, when we look at our SMEs and how we can use this data, and we in cooperation with France, we started this Gaia X project, and I think this is a very interesting project which we should look further into and work on this, that make this happen, so that we can have an infrastructure where you can share easily data and work together with data and maybe develop new products there. And I really hope that this will work out. And again, what I said in the beginning, I said, I think we should be more proud and as Europeans that we can do something similar, that we have the power to develop something like this, but we discuss it often in a very, very bad and negative way.
Thank you very much. I want to get our other panelists, Srinivas and Eniola's take on international cooperation now, but I'm going to take an audience bridge to get there. I'd like to pose our third audience poll first, because it concerns exactly this issue of how do we get other voices into the discussion when it comes to tech regulation driven by Europe. So our poll is this: how realistic do you think it is that European tech regulation will have a positive impact on the needs of countries in the global South? Can we activate that third poll, please? Thank you. And we'll just give the audience a little bit of time to answer. And dear audience, by the way, while you're thinking about this, I'm going to remind you that we would love to hear your questions and short comments. So if you haven't done so already, please do send us your comments and questions, and I will pass them on to our panelists in a few moments. So let's see if we can get some results, and we do have some results here. So far, 55% of you are saying that it is not very realistic to think that European tech regulation would have a positive impact on the needs of countries in the global South. About 45% of you do think it is pretty realistic. So let me take that answer and now go to Srinivas and Eniola for their thoughts on that, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper. So Srinivas, please, you first.
Sorry, can you just repeat the results for me?
Yeah, absolutely. 55% of the audience think it's not very realistic that European tech regulation would have a positive impact on the needs of countries in the global South. So for whatever reason, 55% believe it would essentially diverge in perhaps in focus or in impact from what people in the global South need.
I think we already have an impact, European technology impact on India, if I may cite Estonia. India's vision of the digital infrastructures is actually taken from Estonia. And if one looks at the digital ID implementation, if you look at the whole idea of digitization, transformation of economics to digitization, I think Europe has those experiments in little different countries. It's it's all diverse. It was not unified, as in there was no unified form of digitization across Europe. So in some sense, Europe did have its impact on India, and through India, it is going to have impact on the rest of the global South because we are going to export some of these technologies. But on saying that, we have adapted these systems to our own needs, and maybe so will other African nations or Southeast nations, right? So setting a standard which also has those human rights frameworks and liberal frameworks that Estonia probably did and that India missed out while building these systems, while actually citing Estonia, is something that is important. And I think documenting this is a great way to start, maybe. A lot of people, even within India or the rest of the world, don't know how exactly Estonia has influenced us. In fact, I am trying to find out more information about what exactly has happened in Estonia. I can tell you a lot more about India, but these global effects on how technology itself exports itself, those practices exports across the world through transnational networks is underdocumented. So I will disagree and say that we already have the effect, and India is proof for that.
Very, very interesting indeed. Do you have any concrete example you could share with us in regard to the impact of that approach to e-governance that we know from Estonia and how that might have changed a concrete situation in India? If not, no problem. I don't want to put you on the spot, but it would be of great interest given so many aspects of governance at both local and national level in India that clearly there's been a push for change.
I think this idea of building digital infrastructure, starting with digital ID, is something that was adapted from Estonia, right? Like 2006, Estonia starts their digital ID. It was a smart card system. We kind of modified it and had our own biometrics-based systems, but the core idea did come from Eastern Europe, and it took us a while. I think India started building it from 2009, 2010. It took us about 4 years to accept what Estonia is doing and replicate it. But at some level, in terms of integrating various digital public infrastructures that we are building, what they are also calling the digital public goods. And that's something that heavily is going to be debated, part of the UN, part of the new digital cooperation aspects, right? The world wants these new digital infrastructures and they want nation states to build them. And I am saying that actually came out of Estonia. So that entire setup, it's just not one, but it's just the whole strategy itself came out of Estonia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Inyoli, let me come to you and also for a response in terms of the audience poll and how you see it, but also perhaps you can add to that whether there are areas where you would say that African needs or priorities might differ from those of an EU-driven approach, and what those would be and how we might get African voices into the discussion here in terms of setting standards and rules going forward.
Just a couple of easy questions. No, I think this kind of touches at the heart and the core. And I think, once again, it's back to that stress testing. We're seeing over the past 18 months, at least, that like the ideas we have, the concepts we have, even the roles that we think we're playing. So I agree with, I think it was Jan Hendrik and Anne-Catherine who'd mentioned, Europe doesn't have to be the US and needs to get over that. The US plays a significant role, whether it's through DARPA or through, it's very much innovation, entrepreneurship, pretty much Silicon Valley led, right? So it was private sector led. Europe, I think, is very interesting, and I'm very curious and also a big fan in the sense that it is human-centered led. It is the individual led, it's the individual consumer protection led, which I think is a piece that is significantly missing across the African continent and actually could start bringing in some discussions that tie into the innovator and entrepreneurship space that exists in Nigeria and Kenya and South Africa that are actually doing this. They are responding directly because they have a proximity to the consumer, and they are adjusting their services and their products to the consumer. And once governments get a wind of it, because they may not understand what's going on, they don't understand the amount of transactions that are coming from a Flutterwave, or from the amount of engineers that are coming from an Andela or many other companies, that they want to crack down and want to stop it and then try to understand and then restart it again. But one thing about innovation is it has to work in a cycle, and the government has to either step in, support, or step aside and let it be. And so that relationship is very important for the government to play there. And I think that's where it's not that it necessarily differs in terms of the need, but I think there's actually an opportunity to close the loop. And in fact, it already happens. And Rocket came out of Berlin, came out of Germany, significant VC-backed kind of tapped to that was a technical and capacity building, which it was behind Jumia, it was behind a number of e-commerce and fintech companies in Nigeria and even beyond. So we're seeing this, and to touch again on double tap on this, on the SMEs. So I think the power and the value that I see from an EU perspective is, yes, the vision of the EU project and how that talks about harmonization, and I'm seeing that for AFCTA and how those could be shared much more at the technical and the leadership level. I'm also seeing the SME story and the engagement of SMEs to smaller SMEs, even though the terminology is different for an African context as opposed to a European context. There are massive companies that are still SMEs, which is amazing. Germany, spent a lot of time in Germany and kind of, understand the relationship. I think the third piece is also around just the history, the history between Europe and Africa that exists beyond both cultural, language-wise and whatnot. For better or worse, I think it's something that you can tap into and connect some of those dots there. And there are mechanisms, so the ACP, there are various different mechanisms that exist between the European Union, whether it's UNECA, whether there's so many different mechanisms that we can work within to kind of layer in above DSA and DMA, and the next kind of conversations that need to happen about where do those acts end and where do we need to kind of have a discussion about what else is needed to sit on top or to be stacked above those acts. And also marketing. I think, the US does a wonderful job of marketing its inventions, its innovation and others. And I think there is something about a human-centered innovation that is going to really typify a recovery resilience kind of story from COVID and beyond. I think people are tired of innovation for innovation's sake and really want that to be tied into how does this make a difference for my life, for my community and others. And I think there's a real opportunity there. I also think that it also helps with the conversation where I think India and Nigeria seem to be trending towards, which is somewhat of a very centered command and control approach to technology, partly because in Nigeria, we missed the boat a little bit with our oil, with our kind of central command of our resources. And so there's a misnomer in saying that we don't want to be kind of like sideswiped again, but it's a different story. It's a very different animal in terms of tech as opposed to oil. And so I think that kind of conversation where we layer in a human-centered approach and see our users as consumers, as SMEs, potential SMEs who would sit on these digital platforms that we want to highly regulate. And we're seeing them as digital platforms as opposed to digital services, which many SMEs, at least in Nigeria, are utilizing very much. We are seeing, even with the Twitter ban over the past 10 days, we have lost, I think, in the hundreds of millions in revenue for Nigeria, in dollars in revenue, just because many companies utilize Twitter for commercial activity. So I would kind of typify my response in this way. And I think it probably takes for another panel altogether to have a conversation about how can we really inculcate these and make those mechanisms that exist within the different regions, and really, really double down on the technical capacity pieces that usually really makes the difference. So it's not just the standards and it's not just the regulation models, but it's also the policy sandboxing examples that we can see. And then it's also the technical capacity building that can actually happen at SME to SME level or organization to organization level. And bringing in the OECD, bringing in entities like the IEEE, who are naturally doing this work and have a real kind of discussion that touches on that leadership and that technical aspect.
Thank you very much. And let me take that same topic to Anne-Catherine and ask you whether you feel either within Germany or also within the European discussion that there's sufficient awareness of voices beyond, let's say, the transatlantic channel. And we're going to come in just a moment to the transatlantic part, but I'd first like to talk about that aspect, because in my own work, I certainly do see that Germany's Development Cooperation Ministry is doing some more work now on digitalization and working with partners, particularly in Africa. But it's fairly new, and I think it's still pretty rudimentary. But what's your take? You will know more about
exactly
this.
the same, and I'm also totally new to this. So we want to work on this at the foundation further, because it's I think super important, and I think, as I mentioned before, I think we here in Europe can learn and should learn a lot from other countries like India, like Nigeria, and regarding development, leapfrog innovation, because sometimes these people there are more innovative, more creative, and especially when we have the power here for regulation, and if we want to set global standards, we need to listen to them, because we are not really aware of specific problems. For example, that what Iniola just mentioned, how much revenue got lost because of the Twitter ban. We don't even think about something like this here in Germany, because no one buys something through Twitter, sometimes through Instagram, but even that is not that important in the market. So there are so many different aspects we really need to consider when we do regulation here, and when we want to have our regulation to have a global impact and set global standards, we really need to listen more.
Let me now shift us to two big elephants in the room that we haven't talked about so far. The first one will be the US, and the second one, obviously, is China. But starting with the US, Anne-Catherine, clearly the EU has welcomed the US back to the table and would very much like to have a joint approach to a lot of these issues. And certainly now during Biden's visit last week, we saw some progress on issues such as minimal taxation of tech companies. Quite interesting amongst our various priorities. That's something they were clearly prioritizing. But what about some of the other areas on our list? Do you see real prospects for a close transatlantic alliance, or do you think there are some areas where there's quite a bit of divergence between US approaches and European ones?
Well, of course, regarding freedom of speech, I think, so many people here in Germany, we have huge discussions now about freedom of speech. And I think when it comes to regulation, I think we have a lot of regulation here in Germany and in Europe. And I think the Americans need to start to have their own discussion about regulation and what is freedom of speech for them. Should everything be said online? So currently there can be said everything. And if we want to have transatlantic not relationship, but want to work on this together, I think the US needs to come up with this topic. And I think what is missing a bit is that the Europeans and the Americans have their own discussions regarding tech regulation when it comes to, I lost the word.
You can say it in German if you want.
I lost everything. monopolies.
Yeah, the cartels.
And all this stuff.
Antitrust regulation.
Yeah, antitrust. Thank you. I think, for example, both sides of the Atlantic need to invite people from Congress or from the Commission to talk with each other. So what are the plans? So right now I have the feeling that everyone is doing their own thing, and we're not having like councils together where we come together and plan together what can we do. So everyone is doing their own thing.
And Jan Hendrik, we have a question that has come in from the audience that I would like very much to pass on to you, and it's this. Which other parties than the EU and the US are currently setting tech regulation? And I would add to that, answer that if you would, but also tell us which other parties you see as important partners for Europe going forward.
Well, that's a complicated question. How much time do we have for that?
Not much.
Because in the last, let's say, decade and a little bit more, we have seen the emergence of quite a set of institutions and quite a set of actors active on a global scale, setting tech standards, specifically by channeling money, by financing tech developments through, for example, large scale driven investment funds, for example. There are some that are Dubai based. There are some that are well, complicated to unpack in terms of location and ownership. So those are the actors to deal with on the one hand, and that also creates a situation which translates interestingly to the geopolitical level, because we are used to talking about these questions in terms of governments, specifically in terms of if we say here US and China, for example, or US, Europe and China, then we think about who from the political institutions should sit together and start talking about regulation. While on the other hand, the actor set is much more heterogeneous and diverse. So getting a feet in the door there would really change things in terms of collaborations, in terms of local and global collaborations in that regard. So if you just are flying on a high scale, one might say, well, of course, there are some actors on an international level that would be closer. And of course, people then always mention we have this long connection to the US and share some values and share some ideas. But as Eniola mentioned before, we also share some differences, not in terms of only regulation, but actually how we run tech, for example. Eniola mentioned the Silicon Valley style of investment, while Europe has been trying to push forward human-centered tech in the last decade, and other types of frameworks for that, responsible innovation, for example. And for that, the set of players to play with or to act with and to join forces with is much more diverse than just the three. And if diversity can be nurtured for that, then it's specifically individual collaborations that could join forces in that regard, I guess.
Thank you very much. And Srinivas, let me ask you, because as I mentioned earlier, as everyone has mentioned, India has, of course, become a world leader in a number of areas related to digital technology and the internet. So much so, in fact, that the business tycoon Mahindra recently said that he's sick of hearing Bangalore referred to as the Silicon Valley of India, and he thinks maybe it should be the other way around, and he's running a competition to get new terms that could be applied there. Should and can lessons from India be better integrated into both European and US approaches? And if so, what would be the main areas where you would say, gosh, India has a lot to teach other countries?
Okay. I think I want to go back a little bit and look at the global views of the three dominant players at large: China, US, and Europe. But when it comes to tech, I think India has always been the backbone since Y2K. We emerged as a IT nation and hub during Y2K. And we have been playing a back role, right? Like we never were at the forefront of setting things. And I think now we are emerging into that role. And we are doing that, and this whole new chapter of international digital cooperation, where the plans of replacing IGF, the whole discussions of digital cooperation and how digital regulation itself will happen is going to change. And I think India wants to play a main role. In terms of what you can learn from India, I think it's economics of scale. The one thing that India wants to teach is that we are doing whatever China has done in terms of economics of scale and digitization, that you can leverage some of the aspects of your access to markets, the unified market, the large markets. But at the same time, I would caution that some of the interventions that India has done has caused harm, because we did not look more towards a human rights frameworks or a liberal framework, but prioritized economic development in the digital space. So while saying that, I think India can help give a model. It can give an alternative where we can balance both economic requirements and regulation. And the regulation aspect hasn't yet been decided in India. And I'm hoping as it gets decided, it creates its own model. And Europe, when one looks at Europe, they all say that, oh, you're regulatory heavy. So in that sense, you're not favoring the economy, you're not favoring the emergence of innovation, right? So I think that's something that you can learn from India in terms of economic aspects. And I think India can learn the same way from Europe in terms of regulation and valuing human rights aspects. So I'll just rest it there. But we have always been valuing the economics more at the stage.
Thank you very much. Let me now move us on to China. And we've got a couple of audience questions that have come in on China, and I have some more as well of my own. So the first question coming from the audience on this is, what does the panel think about the dangers posed by China? They are exporting their Great Firewall of China to other countries and their plans such as China Standards 2035. And they're setting technical standards, which of course gives them ample influence. So let me go first to Eniola, because of course there's enormous concern about China's influence in Africa generally. How do you see it in this particular area, in the digital area?
Yeah, I think it's been a topic of debate, China in Africa, or focused on Africa for a number of years now. I think the great Chinese, the fear of the Chinese influence in Africa hasn't really fully been, I think the, what was it? News of my death have been highly overblown in the sense of that China has interacted with many countries based on a very simple thing, which is if you are a small country who does not have a clear idea of what your national interests are, and you are dealing with China, who's very clear of how they want to interact with you, it's just very clear formula that things will probably not work well in your favor. And so I think that in the digital sense, I do think that there is kind of, to the points that have been raised, I think it's somewhere in between is, I think, the model that a lot of us are looking for. There are elements of the European model. There may be smaller elements of the Chinese model that could be valuable. The idea of proximity. For a country like Nigeria, China from a cultural perspective, as it is right now in modern day China, where there was an increase of middle class that is coming up that was in one generation pretty much working class or in abject poverty. That connects in terms of a bit of a storyline for Nigeria as well. And so I think it's very easy to find some very simple connection points from a cultural, from a social perspective, and from the social trajectory and socio-economic trajectory of China over the past couple of decades, that is both aspirational for a country like Nigeria and also dealing with inequality, issues like that It's harder to see in countries in Europe where there could be a social welfare state and others. So I think that there certainly, I would see that leaders, African leaders, have been looking to China, have been looking to India, for the very reasons why I think others have mentioned it may not be a good idea to look at those countries for those reasons. So I think this brings up a big question of what is it that many of these countries want? Essentially, and kind of starting from there, what these countries want, they want to aspire to control or at least be able to regulate technology, understand it better, and utilize it so that they don't have a proverbial egg on their face as governments and as leaders. They don't want cybersecurity attacks. They don't want to open themselves up to unnecessary checks on the sovereignty of the government and others. So I think it's a case of how do we alleviate those fears, those genuine fears. But the problem is that they manifest themselves in ways that undermine human values, human rights, and the like. So I think that for that reason, China is less of a problem. Like the fear of China is less of a problem for me in African countries. The lack of an African, Nigerian, Kenyan viewpoint on what it is that they want technology to do for the country is probably more so of the issue, because any other model will work if you don't have your own. So that's what I would probably kind of say. It may open up a can of worms, but I'd share that. I'm really not doing the China issue. I'm happy to dig deep into that, but I think most of the time we cover China from an African perspective as this fear, rather than let's figure out what we want and then utilize all of these different technology and policy instruments, for which I think digital cooperation across countries is actually one of the instruments that we don't use as well as we probably should.
Thank you. Very, very interesting indeed. No can of worms. It should go unopened if it's relevant to the discussion. So let me come to Jan-Hendrik to also talk about issues related to China and pick up, if you like, on the audience question. But I would also like to ask you perhaps a slightly different take on that, because clearly Europe does know what it wants, at least in regard, for example, to critical technologies associated with artificial intelligence, including facial recognition. And this, of course, is one of the hot potato items when it comes to China. But do you see a risk that going forward, we may come to a kind of a bipolar digital order in which some technologies that would be closely regulated or even prohibited in Europe, for example, facial recognition in many settings, would nonetheless be allowed and used in China and perhaps in other countries and regions as well? And if so, what would be the impact of that back here on us?
That's also a complicated question to answer in a few minutes, but well, maybe joining forces with Injola in that regard, or in drafting an answer to that, at least an attempt to answer that. If you look at the way that, for example, the EU tries to deal with regulating AI, then one of the approaches that it takes is that inside the realm of influence of the European Union, certain types of applications of artificial intelligence are considered high risk, specifically in very specific domains, facial recognition being one, parts that have to deal with automated decision making with no human oversight are others. And it takes a very, let's say, domain specific approach, specifically defining a set of high risk applications and then defining the realm in which that regulation takes place. So that leads to basically, if it works out the way that Europe imagines, that inside the borders of the European zone of influence, not to say the EU, there are certain types of applications of artificial intelligence which are simply not there, or simply highly regulated and put in a framework of large-scale oversight entities and companies and bodies and so on and so forth. And outside of the realm of influence, of course, well, they're there basically, and that leads to a point that Eniola stressed basically, because what China is doing very specifically well actually is to export its model and not due to a regulatory framework or due to setting these standards on a political level, going into negotiations and discussions by simply just adding, well, here's the tech. If you want it, please implement it. And if you have no alternative model at place in countries that, for example, can take the tech on or leave it, basically, well, that creates issues and problems. And it creates not only problems because there are, as Eniola said, not only models that or discussions locally, what kind of digital technologies one would like to have specifically, and what kind of approach to digital technology regulation one would like to have locally, nationally, and so on and so forth, but also because of other players in that game have a different type of export model, basically. So the US model basically being, if you can afford it, just build like a free market version of that. Well, if you can't, you can't, bad luck. And if you take the European approach to that serious, or if Europe would take it really serious, then it would start building, well, strategies for tech and digital tech diplomacy, specifically in that regard, to offer its module of human-centeredness, for example, for two other places, to other actors, and it doesn't really do that a lot currently, but it could, and it would really be a chance actually, and it would really be an interesting way to push that kind of human-centered model into the world actually. Of creating strategy, tactics, and very concretely mechanisms to implement such approaches locally in different places of the world. So building an export model would be good, I guess.
That sounds like a great idea for a follow-on discussion, Anne-Catherine, for a whole other panel. But let me ask you to pick up on a couple of points, if I may, Anne-Catherine. And I have also here from an audience member the following question, which I'm going to link up with a second one related to China. And the question from the audience member is a very basic one. How can we protect liberal freedoms in cyberspace? And let me ask you to link that up with the idea of a values-based, human-centric approach to tech, which essentially is the heart of what the EU says it's trying to do, and ask whether you think that that kind of an approach can become a competitive disadvantage going forward vis-a-vis China with its enormous market, its enormous reach, and its very proactive export stance.
So how can we implement it? I think, first of all, we need to be aware that things like human rights, civil liberties are not, that we shouldn't take them for granted. And I think we do this too often. When I have discussions here in Europe, for example, regarding the copyright regulation, and also with the Network Enforcement Act, there was the UN Special Rapporteur, David Kay, who criticized it a lot, that it's against human rights, like human right of freedom of speech. But this wasn't an argument here in Germany and in Europe, because I think people too often think, well, we're here in, like, very arrogant, like we're here in Germany and Europe. So we don't have any problems with human rights. So this is something for the global South, but it isn't. So we should be more aware when we do our own regulation that it is essential. And also we have to care about human rights and civil liberties. And I think if we were, as I said before, if we are more proud, I think we can use this as an advantage regarding China. I don't think that this is a disadvantage, and I think we, as Jan Henrik already just said, that we should act more regarding delivering products who are human rights centered or human centered, but we are very good in doing some paperwork, writing papers and doing regulation, and not acting according to what we are discussing all the time. And I think this is critical and this is essential.
Mhm. Thank you very much. I wanted to be sure to give the last word on China to Srinivas, as India being China's big neighbor, in many ways also competitor. How do you see the influence of China also within India, but globally? And what would be your main concerns when you look at some of the issues that were mentioned in that audience question? China Standards 2035, the Great Firewall, and so on. What do you worry about?
So at some level, India has been trying to emulate China in terms of economy. One must agree to that China did build its economy over the period, and India has been trying to catch up. We did emulate some, and that has essentially affected our democratic values as well. While stating that, India has been trying to control China. In fact, during the recent geopolitical issue with our borders with China recently, India acted toughly in the digital space. We actually banned TikTok because it was a Chinese company and data of Indians was being shared with Chinese, was being sent to China. So in that sense, we really don't want to let China take control over India's digital cyberspace. At some level, some of these policies, in fact, were also followed by the US during the Trump administration, where they were briefly considering to emulate them. And in that sense, in the digital space, at least, we do not want to cede space to China. We are actively trying to keep them at bay. And I don't know how it's going to evolve, because China also has its own massive programs at place where they can attack nation states in terms of cyber espionage. Where that can lead to is something that we have to wait and watch. That's a threat that India actively feels. But I'm not sure if we are really prepared for a large-scale cyber espionage attack scenario. And that's something the world, in fact, fears, right? US, and I don't know if there has been a threat to Europe from China per se, but every other nation does feel cybersecurity and espionage at a nation level actor is the greatest threat from China.
The biggest source of disinformation in Europe is actually Chinese sources, interestingly enough. So that may be one answer to that. Srinivas, very briefly, what would be the Indian approach on facial surveillance technology, facial recognition technology?
Well, we want to adapt it. In fact, India is constrained to build a national facial recognition system. And it's part of this larger digital infrastructure where we are integrating several databases. And the Home Ministry, Ministry of Home Affairs in India, actively wants to use it to find criminals. And in fact, there are all sorts of experimentations that's happening in Indian cities. In my own city in Hyderabad, we have seen cops stop people, flash their phones on people, trying to see if they're an escaped convict. And that's an extreme scenario that has also taken place. We are trying to push back against this. It's going to take some time for us also how to push regulation around it. But the government as such wants to adapt it. And we are really concerned about how this would play out. I hope we can strike a balance, but the data protection, the draft data protection bill as of now allows all of these, and the government's trying to seek exemptions to allow all of these technologies to happen. Like, in fact, India wants to promote them in some level. These implementations inside government are happening because they want to promote local companies to gain experience with facial recognition, which could be potentially used with digital identity. I mean, facial recognition for digital identity is something that India is actively promoting as well, apart from policing. So as a technology, we really want to adapt facial recognition.
Thank you very much. I have one more audience question on a totally different subject. I'm just going to pass it to Jan Hendrik with the request for the briefest possible answer. The Trump ban, freedom of speech, or did he propagate hate speech, and should he remain banned? In one sentence.
Well, the real question is, who do we actually give that right for oversight and banning? So, and maybe that's the shortest answer one could give, and thinking about democratic institutions that could have legitimate forms of oversight for those kind of questions, instead of just leaving that to the platforms and their internal oversight boards, however they are constructed, would be really helpful.
Thank you very much for that very short and very to the point response. And warmest thanks to all of you for this truly fascinating, multifaceted, and very intensive discussion that we have had here today. I'm very, very grateful to Eniola Maffei, to Srinivas Kodali, to Jan Hendrik Passhort, and with me here in the studio to Anne-Catherine Riedel. It has been a truly enlightening exchange, and I hope perhaps someday we can continue it, maybe even in person. I'd also like very much to thank all of those who were involved behind the scenes in making this discussion possible. Also, of course, the Naumann Foundation for its support, and you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention and your contributions to our debate. It's been wonderful to have you with us. Let me just give you the brief look ahead. Tomorrow at 7 p.m. Central European Time, we will bring together another outstanding group of experts to focus on a different area in which Europe also has ambitions to lead, namely a stronger role in security. Our title is United in Autonomy, Liberal Ideas to Increase Europe's Ability to Act. Please join us. We look forward to seeing you there. Thanks again for being with us. Goodbye.